Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining today's program, in which we will discuss the onslaught against foreign aid and development assistance at the direction of Donald Trump and his new administration. Already, the unprecedented cuts in funding and staffing have devastated the global system that encompasses the fields of democracy, human rights, health, and development. Last week, for example, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, had over 80% of its contracts cancelled, amounting to thousands of projects and countless jobs lost. The African continent, in particular, has been hit hard. And while Trump has grabbed many of the headlines on this topic, it is worth noting that European governments have also been queuing up to downsize their respective aid portfolios, including the United Kingdom, Belgium, Sweden, and the Netherlands. After elections this year, Germany and Canada are expected to follow suit. Some critics have celebrated this downsizing of the aid industry, arguing that it may give Africans the opportunity to stand on their own. This optimistic argument goes that slashing aid could potentially be a springboard to an African renaissance that could foster African solutions to African problems, while leading to a more independent and sustainable future for its people. And yet, while there is no doubt that progress on democracy and development is and has always been driven by African people themselves, any such renaissance will have to reckon with the hard reality of the significant funding cuts. We must also reckon with the fact that the dismantling of the global governance and democracy architecture is being widely celebrated by dictators and autocrats, not just in Africa, but worldwide. With countless democracy support projects being nullified, literally thousands of groups that have been working to prevent human rights abuses or playing critical roles in election observation are now absent from the scene. As a result, the elections will be much easier to rig and to manipulate, giving autocratic regimes a considerably stronger hand going forward. This is the context in which we have convened today's panel. We'll gather expert insights from human rights activists and analysts, as well as those who have been impacted by the USAID aid cuts, to consider the effects, as well as what comes next, and how Africa might capitalize on this period of uncertainty. So, Jeff, how about you remind our audience about what we stand for here at the Resistance Bureau and introduce today's featured speakers?
Absolutely. Thanks, Mentati. Well, to refresh everyone's memory, the Resistance Bureau is here to spotlight the threats to human rights and democracy worldwide, while shining a light on both the personal and collective struggles for freedom, building networks of solidarity that unite us on the most important issues of our day. Today, we are really pleased to have with us Karine Nantulia, a strategic planning advisor at Human Rights Watch, who is among the major voices here in Washington, D.C. and globally, helping to hold abusive regimes accountable to the rule of law and to protect human rights. We also have with us Patrick Atara, a Kenyan columnist and senior editor at The New Humanitarian. He has contributed numerous articles on international affairs to publications around the world, including for Al Jazeera, where he recently wrote on today's topic, arguing that the aid industry has served to prop up imperial domination, with its implosion presenting an opportunity to shape a new order. We are also delighted to be joined by Namete Kokweza, a leading activist from Zimbabwe, one of the hardest countries hit by the recent aid cuts. She is the founder and executive director of We Lead Trust, an organization she started at the age of 18, which focuses on youth leadership, development, and advocacy. Rounding out our featured speakers today is Mac Darling Kobina, a human rights defender from Ghana who has worked for years with marginalized communities. He's a recipient of the UN Development Programme's Red Ribbon Award, which recognizes outstanding grassroots work in the fight against HIV and AIDS. After our main discussion, we will pass the mic to our colleague Nick Cheeseman, who will facilitate the Q&A portion of today's show with Jackie Cilliers. Jackie is a best-selling author, policy analyst, and the founder and former executive director of the Institute for Security Studies, a South African-based organization that combines research, policy analysis, and technical assistance to build prosperity and democratic resilience. And as always, we rely on you, our audience, to contribute to this discussion by posting your questions and comments on our YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter platforms. With all of that said, Mentade, back over to you to start today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So, Mark Darling, I'll start with you. The decision by the US President Donald Trump to dismantle USAID has created a chaos that none of us could have imagined. It sits alongside decisions by other global players who are announcing a similar downsizing. So there are two debates that are on the table. There's one on the long-standing hegemony in the global order that is reflected in the way that one country can disrupt the world in the way that Trump has. And then on the other hand, the indisputable ways that foreign aid creates opportunities for impacted individuals and communities on the continent. Can you reflect on these dynamics and share with us how this sits against your own work today and going forward?
Yeah, thank you, audience. My name is Magdalene. I think that what earlier on we were all rooting for Donald Trump when he was coming, but then when he got in, I think the decisions have affected Africa, I think, badly. I will speak for some of the countries I've been following. For instance, in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and some of the countries that I've followed lately, including Ghana, have issues, especially because most of their infrastructure development is funded by the USAID or PEPFAR. And in Liberia, for instance, there's a lot of programs, especially what we call key population projects that are being funded by US government funding, PEPFAR, that has been affected and has been altered. And then all the workers are seated at home. One of the good, bad aspect of the fund cut is that you know that most of these programs are key population programs are female sex workers, men who have sex with men, drug users and other things. These are populations that are criminalized in Africa. And so these cuts actually help in terms of reducing HIV infections among these populations in Africa. So with these cuts, it means that HIV among this population might increase if other donors do not come in to augment this the shortage or the cut. And so that is what I would say. In Ghana, for instance, currently we're going to host the ICASA this year, 2025, December. And mostly in these conferences, you know, USAID plays a lot of roles. The US government funding and donors organizations play a lot of roles in the CASA event. It means that this year we're going to have a shortage of, in terms of participants coming from these organizations, and the role they play all will not be available at the CASA. So these are some of the things that immediately are being looked at. We're looking at organizations closing down totally because most of their funding or all their funding is coming from the USAID or your PEPFAR project. So these are some of the challenges that so far is been happening. It's affected families and groups and individuals. And for most, the hope is that it will come back and the funding will, these decisions will be reversed, and then the situation will improve for these kind of people. But I must say that the major challenge is that these groups that are vulnerable and marginalized are suffering, and most of these organizations and members are seated at home.
Thank you very much, Mac Darling, for that introspection and for that insight. Karine, I'd like to bring you in here because you have also borne witness to this systematic dismantling of foreign aid, particularly as it relates to the human rights, the advocacy, and the pro-democracy sectors from your unique vantage point. So, you know, the dramatic consequences that we are already seeing that we've just heard Mac Darling speaking about are, of course, you know, great concern to all of us here at the Resistance Bureau, and I'm sure to many of those listening in today. So from where you're sitting and given your relevant professional experience over the years, what are some of your specific concerns that you have about both the short and the long term?
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to the Resistance Bureau for organizing this very important conversation. I echo what Mark Darling just said in terms of the impact on health, especially on health professionals, healthcare centers. But I would like to highlight a few things, and some of it Mantate touched on them. We are looking at losses in terms of human lives, right? I think we as we talk about these massive budget cuts, we also have to remember that human lives will be impacted and are being impacted as we speak right now. I'm from a small country called Burundi. I'm also Ugandan. And when we talk to not just family members, but also friends, family friends whose livelihoods depended on not just on the expertise, but also on contracts they had with USAID funded organizations, their lives have been upended and turned upside down. We work, as Human Rights Watch, one of our key intervention and area of focus is also around crisis and conflicts around the world. As we speak right now, we have a humanitarian disaster in Eastern Congo, we have Sudan, we have the Sahel, we have political crises that have moved into stagnant stalemate in Africa, including in countries like Mozambique. And the direct impact in terms of women and girls and children and men who are stuck in these conflicts and crises is staggering and indescribable. So there's that. The other point I would like to make, and I mentioned Mantate touched on some of these. It's the domino effect. So it's not just, it goes beyond USAID. We see the reduction of humanitarian aid by Western countries. We see also celebration in places like China and other countries who have been competing, obviously, with the US government. There's also global realignment. And I think in terms of the human rights community, we are being faced with a momentous challenge, a global realignment, which we're still assessing. Things are still changing and evolving, but we see a global realignment crafted around the complete transformation of the post-World War II architecture. And what does that mean in terms of the human rights discourse, in terms of the impact in an era on human rights practitioners, movements, the average citizen in an era where you see, for instance, the State Department's Global Engagement Center, which was tracking, disinformation and misinformation around the world, has also closed. So there's a whole transformation in terms of the environment that has really supported the work of organizations like Human Rights Watch, but also our local partners. And finally, I would like to kind of take a moment to recognize the efforts and the work of local partners who, right now are going through tremendous challenges, but who are still working, soldiering on, building solidarity and raising the alarm. And to all those, we need to say thank you.
Thank you so much, Corinne. I think before we go to Namatai, one of the questions I'd want to ask as a follow-up to that is, what do you see as Africa's positioning in this transformation that you're speaking about? What do we need to see in order for us to see something of a progress forward that can potentially cushion us from something like this happening in the future, where one country makes a decision and it totally disrupts a lot of things globally and more so in the African continent?
We already see efforts from African governments. We see different, I'm witnessing multiple conversations around self-resilience. The African Development Bank has put together an emergency fund of about, if I'm not mistaken, around 20 billion. There are efforts in Africa which are worth paying attention to, including some specific levies around, for instance, healthcare needs that countries, I believe Zimbabwe had that around the 90s, many years ago. I'm not sure if it still has that within its national taxation. I think we have there's a task there's an enormous task that African governments and African institutions have to put in place. But what we need, I think, what remains to be seen is how this transition will look like, and how sustainable these efforts will be. We will need to have clear political and ethical leadership, obviously. I'm not sure if it's you, Mantate, who said the whole concept of African Renaissance that existed. It has been in existence in terms of its movement and its philosophy since the early 90s. So this is not something new. It may be that this is an opportunity to revive these discussions within that movement, but it remains to be seen. I think from where I sit, it would be preferable not to think of a replacement, but rather what are the new alternatives that are going to be emerging, as opposed to think, can USAID, can US funding be replaced? I think it's better to really focus on what can be done and what is the new game in town. You hear as well other governments trying who may actually want to fill the gap. Is that a solution? So these are questions I think that need to be answered by Africans and specifically by African leaders.
Thanks so much, Corinne. I'm sure there's still going to be a lot of questions from the audience that are centered around what needs to be done, who needs to do it. But Namatai, I wanted to bring you into the conversation, especially looking at the specific experiences of youth groups. We know that Zimbabwe has been hit particularly hard by the recent cuts to foreign assistance and to civil society in particular, including the sectors of youth and women's leadership in which you work. How have you and your peers responded to this new reality? And despite the many challenges presented to you and your field of work, do you see areas of potential growth and resilience moving forward?
All right. Thanks so much, Mantante, and kudos to the other speakers who spoke before me. So I just wanted to start by putting everything into context with regards to the international system and particularly multilateralism. That, of course, for the longest of times, aid diplomacy was an essential part of the multilateral system. And unfortunately, we are living at a time where there is a lot of bad leadership in the context of just the lack of respect for human rights at an international level. We've had the conversations around aid, and this is not a rhetoric from Americans only, but also from African leaders, where this conversation is had from a place of capitalism, from a place of power, from a place of privilege, but also from a place of patriarchy, without actually, any mention of, the conversation around people, around human beings. And I like how my sister, Corinne, was talking a lot about people. You're pulling out aid and you are talking about it in the sense of money and saving and all that capitalist language, but there isn't much in the way of how does it affect people? How do we calculate the cost on human suffering? How do we calculate the cost on, the young people that we're, getting assistance with regards to, healthcare, access to sexual reproductive health, material that they will no longer get. People are literally going to die. People are literally going to suffer. How do we calculate human suffering? How do we calculate the deaths that are going to be involved? Because it's not just the pulling out of aid, but also the irresponsible nature in which it has been done, which is also very systemically and structurally violent. So having given that backdrop, I just wanted to touch on the issues around young people, women, which I believe that is an intersectional outlook on the aid conversation. So historically, we need to understand that youth groups and women's groups were getting much less with regards to access to donor funding. So naturally, when this pulling out has happened, they will get significantly less. And there are a couple of scenarios that we have to really be aware of with regards to what can potentially happen. So I've had a lot of African politicians say that the cutting of aid is good because it will allow for an evolution in African diplomacy and in African politics, where we will be more independent and we can self-determine. But that in itself is an assumption that is still to be tested, because it has to be tested upon the premise, first of all, of leadership. Do we have the intrinsic ethical leadership to pull it off? It has to be tested in the context of institutions. Do we have the kinds of institutions that are supported by the leaders with the political will to be able to pull off that kind of reimagining and rethinking of African diplomacy and also African consciousness? But also, I think strategic thinking with regards to, since now the dust has risen globally, and eventually the dust will settle and there will be a new order. What are the systemic, structural, and strategic things African leaders are doing to also get a new elevated position within the global order, since things are moving at a very fast pace and a lot of things have been dismantled? So having said that, I just wanted to bring it back locally to talk about the experiences of women and youth, and particularly youth-led organizations. We need to have a very human rights focused analysis, a very human-centered analysis of the pulling out of aid. We need to appreciate that there are a lot of social economic considerations that are coming in at the different people who were a part of the aid system, from the workers within the aid infrastructure to the people who are the beneficiaries, to the organizations that were involved in terms of delivering the services to the community. We have to have an assessment of the social economic impacts, from issues around the material conditions, the social and economic conditions of the people that were aid recipients. If you look at it in a country like Zimbabwe, in which the economy had collapsed, I think in 2021 and 2022, the United Nations was actually saying that more than half of the population needed food aid. And a lot of the resources that were in supporting food aid programs were coming in from the United States. We need to appreciate the kind of food insecurity that will arise from the pulling out of aid. We also have a consideration on issues around healthcare. Over 80% of the healthcare infrastructure in Zimbabwe was being supported by aid. In fact, more than 200 million United States dollars was coming into Zimbabwe to support our healthcare infrastructure because it had completely collapsed and dilapidated. Now, to put things into context, there was recently in Zimbabwe a viral social media post of people who had had a very horrific accident. And because the hospitals that they were taken to did not have sufficient bandages and even plasters, they put cut boxes on these people, literally cut boxes, to support the people that had been injured and had broken legs and limbs and whatnot. So the collapse of the healthcare infrastructure is a big thing, and it was being supported by the aid system. We also understand this to be true in the education system, where we were getting a lot of support. And basically, this critical infrastructure on food, healthcare, and education that was pretty much being supported by donor funding would definitely be affected. And mind you, these are already critical sectors that were already in a very comatose state. And the only reason why they were kept alive was because of the aid. Now, this is a typical example zeroing in on Zimbabwe as a country, but we must understand that this is something that is very real in so many other African countries. And because the African population predominantly has young people, an example is that in Zimbabwe, 67.9% of our population are young people under the age of 35, while 62% are young people under the age of 25. What we understand from this is that it is mostly young people who are getting these programs, and it is mostly young people who will be affected. An intersectional outlook on this means that young men, young women will be affected quite differently. And in most cases, it will be young women who will suffer the most, persons with disability, and people in other intersectional and very much marginalized groups. So to round it up, I've had these conversations about how it's such a great thing that aid has been pulled out. Yeah, it would be a great thing if we have the kind of political leadership that is willing to deal with the issues that are causing the indignifying experiences, to put in place infrastructure that actually builds dignity for people and upholds human rights. A lot of the leaders that are celebrating the withdrawal of aid, they themselves are very corrupt, and they are part of the systems that have resulted in us needing aid in the first place. And as long as we're not having a conversation about that, about ethical leadership, as long as we're not having conversations about building systems that are strong, that it's so difficult for people to loot from everyday ordinary citizens, as long as we're not having conversations about an evolution in our thinking to resort to a very strong Pan-African, principled, ethical way of thinking. And mind you, Pan-Africanism is really about the dignity of the African. And if our leaders are still just talking about Pan-Africanism as a buzzword, as something to make them look good and to look cool, but they're not walking the talk, then it's not such a good idea that aid was pulled out, because it is the ordinary African who will suffer. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much, Namatai. I think that's actually a really good segue to you, Patrick. Given the discussion we've just been having about the need for ethical, transparent political leadership to help fill in some of these gaps that now exist and will be with us for some time. And it's a good segue because, as mentioned at the outset, you're a pretty well-known critic of both the hypocrisy of Western governments, but also the limitations, of course, of foreign aid. So given that we are unlikely to see a revival of aid budgets for the next few years, certainly not during the Trump administration, the question becomes how Africa and Africans writ large can capitalize on this moment, right, to fill in the gaps and write their own futures. So in practical terms, how do you foresee this happening, and what needs to be done successfully today and moving forward in order to meet those challenges? We'd love your thoughts on that.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Jeffrey. I have a couple of things I'd like to say in response to that. The first is, while this is going to be a difficult moment, I mean, there's no getting around that, as has been articulated by all the speakers prior to me. This is going to be tough. You know, people are going to die. It's going to be horrific. You know, so there's no getting around that. I don't think we should sugarcoat it in any way. And saying that there are moments of opportunity here should not be construed as saying that it is not going to be a difficult thing. So I just need to make sure that I'm understood in that sense. But I think there is something for me that's a bit troubling around how the discourse, not this discussion, but the discourse in general of this is evolving. And we seem to be going back to the old narratives of the hopeless continent, of this continent that is incapable of taking care of itself without the help and assistance of good-natured Westerners, you know. And I think that's problematic. You know, I think even thinking about the sort of what it's telling our youth, you know, about what their capacities are and what their capabilities are and what the capabilities of their own societies are, it's quite problematic. I also think that when we simply look at aid, the coming in infusion of money, without thinking about what is being taken out of this continent. You know, the fact that Africa is a net creditor to the rest of the world, or the fact that the West receives, what is it, $7 to $10 for every dollar of aid that it gives. You know, we have to understand the international system is not a benevolent one, you know, the one we find ourselves in. You know, and I think we really need to move away from this frame of charity, that what we are getting is charity, you know, and we need to really insist on justice, you know, and that should be the framework within which we engage the rest of the world. You know, what are we owed? What do we owe them? You know, and let's discuss from that point, rather than simply that, oh, they're taking care of us and, you know, we really require this and without them, we are sort of doomed. You know, in terms of opportunities, I think what this provides us or will force us to do, you know, is to really rethink the system that we find ourselves in and whether it works for us. You know, I think we're going to be forced into the sorts of discussions that Namatai said are missing, you know, about leadership, about how the post-World War II order that Karina referred to, whether that was something that was set up to work for us. You know, I think it both at the level of the nation and the continent, so an internal conversation about what are the shortcomings, and we shouldn't gloss over them, of our countries, of our governments. What are the things that they've gotten wrong? What are the really awful, terrible stuff that they have done? Conversations around corruption, around the diversion of resources, around the failure to decolonize our states so that they actually reflect the aspirations of their people rather than continue the extractive practices that we inherited from colonialism. That conversation needs to be had, and I think this is an opportunity for it. But at the international level, at places like the UN, GA, WTO, etc., we need to have discussions about the international system and the extraction that continues, at the international level, and to start talking about if it's crafting a new order, we shouldn't be waiting for others to do it for us. And unfortunately, what's happened many times is that Africans and African countries have kind of sat back and said, oh, it is the USA's world, or it is China's world. They are the ones who are determining how we are going to live, and we don't put ourselves in those discussions. We don't insist that actually it's our world. We're going to be, I mean, I have a problem with this sort of constant reference to us being the youngest continent, and all of that, but that's for another day. But I still think that we are going to occupy a really big part of this future. And it's up to us to be determining or to be insisting on having a say in what that future is going to look like, and that it needs to serve us. And unfortunately, I think for too long we've kind of sat back. There's rhetoric you hear. My president Ruto, for a while in the last 2 years was like complaining about how they are treated like children when they go for these international functions, how the indignity of having 50 African presidents going to meet one European or one Chinese or one American leader, but they still do it. And that's my thing, is we need to move away from the rhetoric. And I think this, again, what Namataya was talking about, is getting away from the rhetoric to actually discussing it in practical terms. What does it look like? What does it look like for African countries to stand on their own feet, to use their resources for their people rather than to subsidize lifestyles for people in the West? What does that actually look like? What sort of world is required for that to be the norm? I think that's the space, that's the opportunity this creates, or in fact, I would say that's what it forces on us now, because as Jeffrey, you noted, the aid is not coming back, and even when it does, eventually, it's not going to be at the levels before. We should be asking, should it? What is it that I'm not? I don't think aid is an unmitigated good. There is a price we pay, for having it, as I've already articulated. But also in terms of how it corrupts our own societies, how it makes us dependent, on it. All these sort of doomsday scenarios that we hear, which are real and true, we should be asking, why do they exist? Why is it that one country, as Mantate had admitted, one country can hold us all hostage, that the West can sort of cough, and over here we are dying, of fever. Those are the questions I think we need to engage with, and we're going to be forced to engage with. I take a lot of, just to conclude, I take a lot of hope from what I've seen with our youth, especially here in Kenya, and the push for them to sort of take charge of their own destinies, whether it's politically, and the sorts of conversations that they have, about this. And I think that we need to enable and empower those sorts of discussions, and to really actively listen to them, because in the end, they're the ones who are going to live in that future, and they're telling us it's what we have so far doesn't work for them. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I think you're very right to say that this behavior of the hegemonic international power is very telling of the control that they believe themselves to have. And it actually undermines the continent and its countries because it's not looking at them as stakeholders in the global field. And this on and off switch should really leave the continent and its leadership really rethinking the role that they need to be playing in the placing of the continent in the individual countries as well, because in as much as we're saying Africa, I do know that all of our different countries have different relationships, different experiences. But again, these are collective, again, as a continent of a shared experience. So thank you so much to all the panelists for the submissions so far. And we are going to now move on to the question and answer session of today's show that will be led by our colleague, Nick Chisman, who will also bring in today's discussant, Jackie, to get his reflections on the conversation thus far. So Nick, over to you.
Great, thanks. And thanks everyone for the brilliant comments so far. Just before I bring in Jackie, who I know has been doing some really interesting work looking at the actual projections for, economically what the withdrawal of this aid might actually mean, I wanted just to flag one other thing. I mean, I think one thing that we might want to start talking about is, concretely what really needs to happen if this is going to be a great moment, as Patrick says, to realize, new directions, to take control, to build more sustainable homegrown solutions, to get out of the international kind of aid trap. And I think one of the things that would obviously need to happen, as Patrick was talking about from his own Kenyan experience, where, I was recently and I know well, the youth-led protests, right, which really pushed back against President Ruto's government, pushed back against the finance bill, mass citizen mobilization, demanding more accountability, rejecting, ethnic forms of identification. And I think one of the things we would need over the entire continent in the next 2 years is really strong accountability pressures to push leaders away from corruption and graft towards delivering services. There are countries like South Sudan and others that spend a very tiny portion of their budgets on healthcare, effectively relying on the fact that the US was providing 60-70% of the budget for their healthcare systems. Those countries are now going to have to cut corruption and push that money into the healthcare system if they're going to keep people alive. My suspicion is that in a lot of countries it's not going to happen, though, unless we get real civic mobilization. And it's a real opportunity, right? Unfortunately, the fact that we know that a lot of people will be harmed and hurt is an opportunity for mobilization and for actually pushing, on governments the fact that it's unpopular to provide poor quality services. It's unpopular to actually be corrupt and not deliver. But that means we also then need to find ways, of course, of channeling that. And one of the things I just wanted to flag before we go to Jackie, who's going to have a lot more to say than I do about the projections and the impact, is that one of the things that really worries me, having just come back from Malawi, is one of the things that is going to be hurt is the democracy sector and the civil society sector. And in a lot of countries, the organizations that were doing the domestic monitoring, the civil society monitoring, really bringing different African perspectives to elections and to democracies, were getting funded by USAID. Some of those will keep going. Some of those have been utterly destroyed. Some of those won't be able to do the work they would normally do in elections that are coming up this year, next year, and the year after. So one of the things that really worries me is that exactly at the moment where we really need accountability, civil society mobilization to be at its highest, actually a lot of those institutions are suffering massive setbacks. Thousands of people in lots of countries across Africa who work in the democracy sector, who have the skills that we need, are now scrambling because they've lost their jobs. And with losing their jobs, they risk losing their houses and they risk losing their cars. And so one of the things that we haven't talked about today is about the impact of how unplanned this was, right? There was no care and attention taken to people's lives, to people who had bills, who had mortgages, who had, thousands of people, and the thousands of people that depended on those thousands of people who have been, really disrupted. And one of the things that, I worry about a little bit this year is that we've just got so many great activists and democracy organizations and leaders out of work across the continent who are going to face really difficult, economic times. And I don't think, and I think it's a way of saying, because people at home might not have fully understood, that people really realize around the world that there are hundreds of thousands of people across Africa who also are owed money by the US government government who contracted them to do a job and whose salaries have not been paid because consultants across the continent were not paid the last tranches of their salaries, and now USAID doesn't actually have the individuals left in the right places to process those payments. So we have people who are actually, not only losing their jobs, but actually being ripped off by the US government, right? In a legal activity that is actually quite scandalous. And the extent of that, I think, has also been missed and is something that we need to come back to. It's also something, bizarrely, I think, which is shooting the US in its own foot, right? This is really self-defeating because this is communicating the message across African countries that the US can't be trusted, that the US is not a reliable partner, that the US can't be a stable development supporter in future. And actually, that's ceding a tremendous amount of soft power. Right. The other thing we haven't talked about today is the soft power shift in the US pulling out this much financial support. As Patrick said, aid is not provided simply because countries care about other countries. It's provided for all sorts of leverage. Aid has been provided for a long time to generate policy leverage. In cutting aid in this way, the US is sacrificing tremendous policy influence and leverage across Africa. On the one hand, we might celebrate that, right, for the reasons that Patrick rightly says. But we also need to be a little bit worried about what's going to fill that vacuum. Because we know in the Horn of Africa right now, what is filling that vacuum is the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and a bunch of authoritarian middle powers from elsewhere in the world. And one of the impacts of that has been to prolong and worsen the civil war in Sudan, could be to prolong and worsen in the future a conflict between, say, Eritrea and Ethiopia. And so we need to also think, I think, about not just the absence of aid and the absence of kind of problematic Western pressure, but what might happen in the absence of that, right? That is not happening kind of out there in a vacuum. It's happening in a world with other pressures and other forces. And other countries are now going to come in with their aid and their support. The UAE recently gave a 1.5 billion loan to the government of Kenya, for example. And all of a sudden, we're going to have a very different game of international engagement, which might turn out to be even more problematic, from the point of view of a longer-term African renaissance than the one that we've just been playing. Anyway, so those are a few thoughts just on the top of my mind about what we might want to keep in mind in the Q&A. But I want to bring in Jackie now. Jackie's, for many of you will know, Jackie's been a key figure commenting on issues around democracy, security, development in Africa and South Africa for a long time. Many will be well known to many of our listeners as a key figure. But I also was really interested, Jackie, in some of the things that ISS have been talking about recently. You've been talking about in terms of the projections. I also know that you've done fantastic work outside of this on projecting African futures and thinking about what the future might be like. So I think you're the perfect person to be a discussant for this show. And without further ado, over to you. We're looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks for the invitation and for inviting me. It's actually a pleasure and an honor to be part of this conversation. I want to start off by reinforcing, Nick, many of the points that you made with regards to what is the impact going to be on democracy, human rights, because these are certainly going to be under considerable pressure, particularly if we look at the broader context that we've seen the last few years, which is an era of where global growth and particularly growth in Africa is slowing down. And that means more pressures on a variety of things. But let me back off and just for a minute or two tell you. So I head a program at the Institute, at the Pretoria office of the Institute for Security Studies that does long-term forecasting, and we do forecasting on each and every African country, and we do it in various sectors. And one of the sectors that we have done work on is or a sector that we call financial flows. So we look at what is the impact of aid, foreign direct investment, remittances on development prospects. So we tend to look at where a country is headed on a so-called current path forecast or business as usual. And then for each African country, we model actually 8 sectors. But one of them, financial flows, where we looked at the impact of aid and so on and so forth. And shortly after the US aid reduction announcement, we very briefly did a sort of a quick and dirty analysis of what the impact would be on the 2 major indicators that we generally use, which is GDP per capita and extreme poverty. Now, as most of you know, the US is the largest aid provider to Africa. It's about 26% of aid, and we sort of said, okay, if most of that is taken away, what is the impact? Because there are a number of countries, about 12 countries, that receive more than $400 million per year from the US, including my country, South Africa. And of course, we know that East Africa is going to be particularly hard hit. And our finding was that next year, about 5.7 million more Africans will be classified as extremely poor. That is, their income would be less than $2.15 per person per day next year. And yeah, so that created quite a stir. And we then went back to have a look at, our broader forecasts of the impact of aid, foreign direct investment, remittances, as well as illicit financial flows on Africa. Now, as most of us know, increasingly following various reforms, most aid goes to poor countries, to low-income countries. So about 53% of aid goes to Africa's 22 low-income countries. In those 22 low-income countries, there are about 294 million extremely poor Africans. And aid will reduce support, will increase poverty by about 4 million people in those countries. So that is significant. But if we then look at the impact on education and health, particularly health, the impact is going to be quite severe. If you look at enrollment levels, primary, lower secondary, upper secondary, and so on. For example, we also played around with what is the impact of a complete reduction in aid to Africa by 2030, and did some calculations. I was quite some forecasting. I was quite surprised to see that as over the years the importance of aid has declined, and its impact therefore is also declining. But certainly areas like democracy, Nick, as you indicated, are going to be probably the hardest hit, because some of the work that we do, we compare democracy given levels of development, and our finding, quite sometimes a bit surprising, is that levels in democracy in Africa and is higher than one would expect given levels of development. It sounds a bit strange, but we refer to this as that many African countries, despite the democratic downturn, for many years have had what we refer to as a democratic surplus. We are slightly more democratic than you would expect given our levels of development. And of course, some of that propping up was a function of development aid from the West that used aid for its ideological and other purposes. And that's going to fall away. And of course, as we all know, other partners, Germany and so on, are also reducing their aid, the UK and others. And the foundations that are left won't be able to pick up the slack, nor will the European Union. So there's going to be significant pressure. So we often hear the mantra that, and it's sort of, we celebrate the end of aid dependency in Africa. But when you look at the importance of aid to poor countries, what we often hear about is that Africa should trade itself out of poverty, that foreign direct investment is going to solve our problems, or that the private sector needs to be unlocked, and that will resolve Africa's development challenges. And unfortunately, when you speak about poor countries, low-income countries, that is not really the case. Africa's 22 low-income countries have about 0.4% of global trade, and Africa's 24 lower middle-income countries have about 1% of global trade. And large multinationals don't come to poor countries. So when the role of the government is important, the role of a government that is capable and that is accountable is hugely important. So I am very concerned about what the impact of this would be, the reductions on aid that we, in one sense, celebrate, on development prospects and on the quality of governance. There is a lot of corruption, a lot of challenges associated with aid that have been written about extensively, dead aid and all of these issues. But this is certainly bad news, I think, also for democracy, for the soft power, Nick, that you refer to. Aid, of course, is going to remain. It's going to change. And I think what we also need to do is discuss how it should change, how we can make aid work more effectively and get away from some of the negative characteristics that we've often seen, the per diem cultures, the hundreds of thousands of consultants that are engaged, and the lack of disbursement and engagement of aid in country as opposed to down the food chain. So just a few remarks, Nick, to complement, I think, your excellent introductory remarks, and let's have a conversation on this.
Great, thanks. It's really useful, I think, also to pull us back and to think about those other economic processes and trends that are happening. And one of the things we'll do is after the shows, we always like to share people's links and data. So we'll share the link to what you were discussing at ISS on our social media. We'll share also maybe, for example, some of Patrick's pieces, some annotated pieces, etc., so that we can open up access to those amongst our listenership. So maybe, what we could do now is to think about maybe going backwards through the panelists. Maybe, Patrick, we could come to you first and hear your reflections on some of the things that we were just talking about, and then work backwards through the panelists and sort of reverse order in terms of thinking about, these very practical questions now about what is the actual size of the opportunity. Jackie's maybe suggested there were some challenges here as well. I think, Patrick, your point before about reconceptualizing aid and not talking about it in terms of charity, but framing it a different way is a really important one. And of course, in some ways, there's space to do that now for two reasons. One, because of the alternative options for borrowing and lending and financial assistance that I was talking about, the Chinas, the Russias, the UAEs, there is an opportunity in that process to start reframing because Africa is given more agency from that. But also because aid budgets are going to be smaller, there's also an opportunity in that sense to be able to push back a little bit more than perhaps was the case previously. What do you think actually needs to happen, in that process? How would you like to see, as Jackie said, aid is not going to completely disappear. There will still be quite a lot of European countries giving significant amounts of aid. The US will continue to give aid for things it cares about, which might not be things related to equality and so on, but there might be forms of support that will be given. What would you like to see in the future, be a way of reimagining that? And then rest of the speakers will go backwards through your order. So if you could start thinking about your own responses and engagements as well, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. Over to you, Patrick.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think for me, it all starts with how we conceptualize this interaction that we have with the rest of the world. And I think there has been a tendency for a very long time for us to almost conceive of ourselves as wards of the rest of the world, that they're there to take care of us, and stuff. I think it has always been a misconception that exists both within the continent and outside of it, and one that does not really recognize lots of the work that is done by Africans themselves to both work on improve their own countries. I think when Jackie speaks of levels of democratization being surprising, I think a lot of that is due to efforts within the continent itself, by people pushing for these changes. I mean, I think we had a discussion here at the Resistance Bureau, I think a few years ago during the US election, and we were asking about the systems that we have for ensuring or trying to get good and credible elections, and comparing them with what the US has, or more accurately doesn't have. And I think a lot of work has gone into this. So I'm not as pessimistic, about our ability to overcome this. And the other thing, I think, the other thing to think about is sort of the proportion of aid to Africa's GDP, which is about 2%, a quick Google search told me, so we've got to again keep this in perspective. Yes, it's different in different countries. Some countries are more dependent on it than others. And I'm not saying that 2% doesn't matter, but it is still 2%, and you have to keep that in mind. So these are not insurmountable issues that we face. They are difficult, but they are not in any way things that we cannot overcome. What do we need to do that? As I said, reframe the conversation, reframe how we think about this interaction that we have. So I think it should be predicated first on an understanding of the reality, which is that actually we give out more than we take in. That's what is meant by saying that we are net creditor to the world. If you look at the flows of money and resources, what we give out is much more, than what comes in. So we have to have conversations about that. Why aren't our resources being used for us? And I think if we start from the conceptualization of what is just, so it's not charity that we are asking for. What we want is justice. Whether that looks like reforming the trade system. I mean, Jackie talks about the difficulty of trading our way out of this. But I think the reason why it's difficult to do it is because of the systems that we already find ourselves in. The sort of extractive systems that leave us as producers of primary commodities, and make it difficult for ourselves to, whether it's industrialize or to move on to other stages of don't like the word development, but of, let's say, production, etc. Where we can actually input value or add value to what we are producing. Why is Congo poor? Those are questions we need to engage with, and to a large extent they have been there. People have asked them, but I don't think as a continent we have seriously sat back and actually worked out these are the issues, and then this is what we should do about it. And I think that's where we should start ourselves. And finally, I think I'd said before in my comments that this has to be both an internal and external conversation. So we have to look at where our responsibility lies ourselves, for the situation we find ourselves in, and what we need to make, the changes we need to make internally, to get out of it, but also to the external system.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. I'll just give Jackie maybe an opportunity just to say, how significant is 2%? Because I think that's a really good question, right? 2%, is that a big number? How significant is that? And then we'll move on. Jackie, just come back, Patrick, on that, because I think that is something that, people at home might be thinking about themselves.
No, thanks, Nick. I put it in the chat function. So aid is about 2.2% of Africa's total GDP. But as we've said, much of aid goes to low income countries, and then about an equal percentage to low middle income countries, and then very little to Africa's 8 upper middle income countries. I previously, in our little modeling, we said that that the USAID reduction would increase extreme poverty, that is using the $2.15 extreme poverty income level, by about 5.7 million people. But remember that Africa has got, what did I say, about I've lost my number there. Just hang on one second. Africa has got 488 million extremely poor people at the moment. So that's about a 1.2% increase in extreme poverty. But the other factors, reductions in school enrollment, in health, and all of those factors, and we've been discussing democracy, those factors we also need to unpack. It is going to have a huge impact, I suspect, particularly in the health sector. So one must not underestimate, and I think previously the commentators made the point, the extent of the disruption that is going to occur, particularly in the way that this has happened. This is literally from one day to the next. You have an entire industry, sector that has been decimated. And the damage that has been done, including, Nick, as you mentioned, to US soft power and to perceptions about who is prepared to assist Africa. This is really going to be a huge issue on the continent.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that might be worth just saying is that in some ways, I think the 2% of GDP figure is perhaps not the most useful one.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, to me, the most useful figure might be, for example, what's it as a percentage of the government spending and budget in a given year? And when you look at that figure, it can be in some countries, not in all, but in some countries, it can be 10, 20%, right? And so that's, if we were to go, Patrick, say to Kenya, we think about, okay, you've got a government in President Ruto who's desperately trying to find a way to meet Kenya's debt repayments while not increasing taxes. Like in that context, 2% of GDP becomes a lot, right? Because that's another 2% of tax that Kenyans are going to have to pay if Ruto's going to be able to pay off the debt. And that probably means another set of protests. But let's peg that for 1 second. Thank you, Jackie. That was very useful. I want to
Nick,
just,
if I may,
sure, go for it. I'm just going to throw it over.
Yeah.
I'm just ask for Jeff and Mantade, because they both have a lot of knowledge about aid and the way that aid works and Africa engages, whether they want to come in and throw in some of their own insights before we go over to Namate. But Jackie, a quick word from you and then over to Jeff and Mantade.
That was Patrick was.
Yeah.
Oh, Patrick, sorry, Patrick. Patrick, over to you.
Yeah. Sorry. I just wanted to mention quite very quickly about sort of the need to indigenize sort of the democratization movement. One of the big sort of sticks that people have been using, politicians have been using, to beat activists over the head is this idea that they are puppets of the West. And you hear that being repeated over and over again. I think that's a conversation we need to have, is how do we move away? I mean, even if you're to date this back to the 90s, at least the growth of civil society organizations, etc. It's 30 years later, 40 years later. We need to have a conversation about how do they stop being reliant on outside help and they become, organizations that are properly, indigenous ones that are funded and are kept alive by a local resource rather than being seen as the sort of perpetual puppets of the West.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, a smart point, and strategically an important point. And it's also true that, one of the things that sometimes comes up in conversations where you get groups of activists from different, countries is the suggestion that actually, your social movement is much more effective if it's not top-down funded, right? That takes out some of the energy of it. It turns it into a civil society organization that has to fill out log frames. And what you need to be able to do is build something that's more sustainable from the grassroots. I think there is a real, that's where the really exciting opportunities are, right? To actually develop something new there. I guess the question is, what would that new model take, and how do all of us kind of try and find ways to support it, recognizing the sort of financial logistical challenges in the absence of that kind of external funding. But you're right, if you could build that, it would be much more robust, precisely because, anti-NGO, anti-foreign engagement laws of the kinds that we've seen passed across, hundreds of countries around the world after Russia's Foreign Agent Act was passed, those kinds of legislations wouldn't be as powerful against an organization that was, purely domestically rooted and majority domestically funded. So there is a sort of resilience that could be generated if we could find ways of doing that. Jeff, over to you, and then Namate coming to you and to the rest of the panelists. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nick. Just hearing Jackie's presentation and Patrick's further remarks, it really got me thinking that, I agree with a lot of what Patrick was saying about, we shouldn't deny the importance of some of these short-term development interventions, whether it's assisting African partners to staunch the spread of Ebola, or building schools, or vaccinating children. Stopgap measures certainly have their value, and they often save lives that would otherwise be lost or devalued. And Karine and Namate and Mac Darling brought this up and provided some excellent examples. But I wonder if, when we're talking so much about reorienting our thinking and seeing this current environment in which we're living as an opportunity to sort of rethink some of this, I wonder if these interventions should be properly identified as tactical measures and not a feature of long-term strategies. And what I mean by this is that I think and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe Jackie has some data on this and certainly would welcome others' thoughts, but it seems to me, based on all the data that I've seen, is that a healthy democracy is essential for boosting a country's development outcomes. I think the data shows this. I think it shows that African citizens understand this fact. They have lived it. And I wonder if donors and major development organizations going forward would be wise to follow their lead. I think first and foremost, democracy has been shown to improve a nation's overall health. This is because democratic governments are inherently more open, they're more accountable, they're more transparent, they're protective of media freedom. In this enabling environment, right, it allows leaders to be more responsive and use feedback to improve the quality of basic services. And Nick, I think you mentioned this. Democratic nations are also more likely to increase their own spending on healthcare in the long term, which of course benefits all sides involved. And then secondly, there's also strong evidence that democracy leads to stronger economies, right? This democratic advantage, and I think this is evidenced in some of the work that Jackie and ISS has done. This is especially pronounced for African countries that have remained democratic for longer periods of time. And why is this? This is because autocratic leaders in South Sudan, which has been mentioned and elsewhere, they failed to implement the needed reforms that would sustain economic growth. So since they're not held accountable and because aid continues to flow regardless, they really have no incentive to act in the public interest. And then third, states that hold free and fair elections and leaders who abide by basic democratic principles are inherently less corrupt. They're better positioned to prevent non-state violence, acts of terrorism, and other crises. So I wonder if we should be using this opportunity to maybe better focus and work towards addressing the causes of crises, whether they're humanitarian, political, economic, or social, as opposed to its symptoms. Because to me, and I would definitely, like I said, be interested to hear what others have to say. The evidence is clear, and it's that positive development outcomes are dependent on democratic foundations. So back over to you, Nick, and maybe for others to chew on that a bit.
Thanks very much. Jackie, I see you got your hand up, but I need to get to the other panelists first. I'm going to try and fit you in at the end, but I want to make sure that the people who haven't spoken as much so far get another chance. So Namate, back to you, and then we'll go to the other speakers. Jackie, if we can, I'll give you an opportunity to come in on that later on, because I know you've been doing some work on it. Namate, over to you.
All right, great. So I think my responses, I've structured them from a place of starting off with reflecting on what can happen within the international system until we reach the domestic, and then we eventually reach the NGO itself in this aid matrix. So the first thing I wanted to say is that we need to be very much aware of how international relations work, and particularly looking at this from a place of realism. The fact that aid in itself is part of the multilateral system. We appreciate how it came to be and what it turned into. So initially it was we need to help countries that are struggling to be economically stable, and then eventually turned into diplomacy, in which it would literally be used as a carrot to get certain countries to behave. And if they did not behave, they would be threatened that it would be cut. And I think for a long time it was actually quite effective, which I agree with Patrick that it brought about a lot of indignifying conditions, but also shifted the paradigm of the African away from the idea of self-determination, which was a very critical thing and a very big movement in the 1950s, 1960s with people like Kwame Nkrumah. So aid did turn into something else. And the dependency that was created by aid is not a thing of circumstance or chance. It was actually very intentional and deliberate, because it gave certain states power over other states. It gave them leverage in negotiations. It also meant that they could tell other states to behave, and they would behave. So when we then want to have a conversation around how to turn this around, I think it's very important for us to start off from where Patrick was saying that we need to be very clear about who we are, about ourselves. Who do we think we are as Africans? Who do we see ourselves as becoming in this world? We need to reframe and also change the narrative. And I think the principles upon which we change that particular narrative must be based off of justice, Pan-Africanism, and also the right to self-determine. Now, this talk about justice is about historical injustice. There is a current ongoing colonial system that finds itself in the global order, which has also made the multilateral system impossible to implement. I'm a big believer in multilateralism, but the way it has been implemented in the past century has been problematic. And it was not problematic by default, it was problematic by design because other states recognize the power in them being able to have all the resources and to finance the multilateral system. I mean, the UN, 40% of about 40% of its budget was coming from the US. When the US pulls out of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, the whole world, takes the heat and it's a very hard blow. Patrick was mentioning about how when USAID is pulled out of all these countries in the world, the whole world is held at ransom. We're literally catching the cold because the Americans are sneezing. But we as the world cannot just say that the Americans are responsible for this. We also allowed this to happen to us. And at no point in the world must this ever happen again, where one country has so much power over the rest of the world that they hold everyone else at ransom. And if they pull out, the whole world feels it. But on the other hand, we need to talk about this word power. And I think we've really talked about it from the place of the Americans, but not necessarily from the place of the African. If we're going to turn things around, we need to build power for the African. And building power for the African literally means, and some of these things are things you won't like, but I think they're things that have to be said. It literally means rethinking the multilateral system. There have been for the longest of times this idea of one nation, one vote at the United Nations. A lot of unpopular figures, including Robert Mugabe, would advocate for that. I never liked the guy, but I think it was a rhetoric that was said around, and it is a rhetoric that is important because it kept so many states down. And if you come back to where we talk about aid as a tool for diplomacy, states that would not vote in a certain way were not given aid. So it was literally them being manipulated and hoodwinked into behaving. You had to behave, you had to belong to a certain faction in the global order for you to actually get access. We then need to talk about historical injustice from a place of economic injustice that is strongly linked to security and resources. We must always realize that the military might of certain powerful nations, including the United States, is particularly centered around securing economic interest and resources. And that is the rule. Wherever the military goes, usually there are interests that they want to protect, which are usually economic interest. And if we're not having that conversation with regards to the manipulation of the financial system, the international financial system, yes, I like this conversation about corruption and domestic accountability of African states, but we also have to have a conversation around the manipulation of the international system that has happened, and it's violent, it's vicious. So many people have been affected economically. So many states, even that have good, well-meaning leaders, cannot ever rise up to the level that they need to get to because the international financial system is rigged against certain states. So if we're not having a conversation around justice at that level, where some countries, if they're not getting their economic interests and they're not getting their way economically, they'll use their military. That's their power. And African states don't have big militaries. We cannot protect ourselves. There will be a lot of destabilization, a lot of wars that never end, sponsoring of rebels. This is the other side that we don't want to talk about. That's so ugly. Then we might have a problem. So what do African states do? Number one, build solidarity with each other. Continental free trade area is a must. We need to have our own currencies that we use as African states. We need to trade amongst each other, free movement of the African across the continent. These are some of the basic things that we can do. We need to have economic solidarity in that way as well, where we trade with each other. The next thing that we have to have a conversation about is security for African states. Why is it the Americans are allowed to have a big military, but Africans are not? Why is it that the Europeans can do that, but Africans are not? And I think that's something that we also have to have a conversation about. I am not all for armament. I've never been a fan of armament because I know the moment you have too many arms and too many big militaries, the next thing is war. But I think this idea of, Africans must not do this, but everybody else can do it is very problematic, because when we then want to secure our resources, we do not have, the ability to do that. We do not have the capacity to protect ourselves, which is also problematic. Then I just want to end it up, on the very local and domestic level. And these are points that I echoed initially around leadership. Locally, internally, I've talked about the global geopolitics. Locally, internally, we cannot escape this reality. We need to have a big conversation in Africa around rethinking leadership and an ethical shift in our leadership. We have to take accountability. It cannot all be the Americans, it cannot all be the Europeans. There has to be a point where we take responsibility, because that's the only way we can chart our own destination, our own destiny. Institutions, building strong institutions that fight corruption. There's a lot of corruption by African leaders. And this is what's creating a lot of the crisis that leads us to needing aid in the first place. And having very strong Pan-African and human rights focused approach to how these institutions are built and strengthened. Then lastly, I think just on the NGO itself, I don't think it's such a bad thing that funds have dwindled for African NGOs. Because I think some of them had lost flavor and personality, because a lot of the agenda setting would happen based off of what the donors had to offer. What I will say is that when we had a lot of donor funding, there was a lot of formalization, there was a lot of donorification, there was a lot of professionalization, which sometimes was sucking out sucking out the life from social movements. So the place that we are in now is forcing us to rethink what the NGO of the future, what the civil society of the future will look like. And I think sustainability means taking a very strong social enterprising model. That we have to really look at models around social enterprising. What can NGOs do to help them actually have a product or something to sell, to actually get resources? I think that's something that I've had, and I know that there are different places where it's being experimented, but I think that's something that we have to accept. The next thing that I think is very important is to focus on African philanthropy. Can we have a conversation with African business leaders? And I know some of them might be reluctant because they benefit a lot from their arrangements with the African governments. But can we have a conversation with them around them being able to sponsor the African NGO? I think that's something that's big that we also have to really think about. The final thing about what also NGOs can do locally is to go back to basics. Which is basically social movements. The current idea of how we are organized as NGOs is something that is a bit more modern. But if you look at the liberation struggles and how people were able to organize, it was mostly community-centric. And they were able to achieve their objective. That is something that has been drawn away because the idea of transformation has been loaned or basically been left to a bunch of professionals in NGOs who speak good English and can write good proposals. And yet there is so much value from the community that we are not tapping into, because it's now like, let the NGO people do it. So I think we have to go back to basics to rebuild social movements, do more in the work of political education, civic education for young people, and to allow organic movements to sprout and to support them. I'll end here for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Namatsaya. Thanks for bringing some positivity and some constructive ideas for moving forwards. That's really valuable, I think, at this stage in the conversation. Corinne, you've got your hand up, and it's also your turn to speak. So all of our stars are aligning. Over to you.
Oh, my goodness. Sorry. Yeah, I thought I was I was a little bit concerned that I was running out of time because I had to leave. Well, thank you. Namatai, I think, touched on most of the points I wanted to raise, but I just wanted to highlight a few things. One, I think Jackie and you, Nick, mentioned the transformation or the regression of US soft power. I think this is for the US government to really to address and not. I think if we think of the impact on Africa, I think it's important that Africans as well think of the soft power and the global mobilization that Africa can actually project and its convening powers. So that's the first point I wanted to raise. The other one is that we need to have confidence in the citizenry citizenry and grassroots mobilization that has taken place for hundreds of years in Africa, starting with the Mandin Charter in the 13th century. I think we have that in our history, we have that in our culture, and linked to that, and something Namatai also mentioned, we have to rethink, I wouldn't say to even rethink how civil society groups are formed or operate, because I think we all, the civil society movement and social movements in Africa are not homogeneous. You have the Ballet Citoyen, you have the Sindu Muja in Burundi, you have the Lucha in Congo, while at the same time, you do have more formalized and more professionalized, quote unquote, civil society groups. So we already have a certain makeup which may need to be amplified and encouraged. The other point I wanted to raise is a whole global alignment, realignment, which we should also observe and assess at the regional level, in terms of which countries are going to really be more responsive in the multilateral spaces they find themselves in. A good example is BRICS. And the other point is having civil society groups and social movements having to be creative when we think about rethinking what the response, the African response should be. I think there's a lot of innovation and creativity that is already present. I've mentioned that, including advocacy calls and initiatives that Africans themselves at the local level have already done. And the Continental Free Trade Agreement is one of them. It's been discussed, it's been pushed by African civil society groups as well. We will need to see, it will be interesting to see the relationship that can be developed between the private sector, businesses. Namatai mentioned African philanthropies, but also the private sector within African countries and the civil society. And again, do what Africans have done for centuries, decades, which is being able to build a momentum and pressure their leaders, elected or not, on issues that are close to their hearts, including pressing African governments to boost and maybe to reduce some of their funding in some of the sectors, including the military, and having a more balanced approach when it comes to funding sectors of health, education, food, and water, etc. Thank you. I think that's about it. And thanks for everything.
Thanks, fabulous. Really appreciate it. We are starting to run out of time, so everyone don't worry. We are going to start wrapping up soon. That was a great contribution, so thank you very much. Mac, darling, it's been a little while since we were with you, but I know you've been listening to everything that's been said. It'd be really great if you could take it home for us and give us a sort of final few words on your reflections on everything you've heard since you made your own opening remarks.
Yeah, so I think this serves as a lesson for Africa, and I think it's now time for us to take the fight. We need to develop new strategies. I think in our country, I think our government has also taken initiative to see how to augment the funding from the US government. And so I think that other countries are also doing the same. And so in the way forward, I think it's going to come back. I think aid is going to come back better or not, or then much improved, because I think that the systems that are in place already previously do not help Africa and is not helping our systems, because there are a lot of corruptions within the systems. The aid comes with strings attached. Monies are given to organizations that are, friends and cronies. Systems were developed around all these aids. And so for me, I think that it's good that these aids have been cut, and then there's going to be systems put in place to maybe future aids. And then the African governments are also going to put some of these strategies that have been put together to make sure that we stand stronger and better. Thank you.
Thanks so much, McDarling. Okay, Jackie, you've been very patient. I'm going to throw it back to you, but please keep it short because we are going to need to go to the outbrief from our wonderful hosts very quickly.
Thanks, Nick. Very interesting comments and discussion. Just one or two remarks. So as you know and refer to, we do long-term forecasting on growth and development across various sectors and so on. The first thing is just that, and it's sort of come out, but we go forward and backward in this. Africa needs help in the sense that it needs China, it needs Europe, it needs the US, it needs Middle East, the new emerging countries, because we need to trade with them. We need to be part of a global and growing economy, and for that we need to be part of that. It needs aid, particularly low-income countries. We need to change how that aid operates. It needs to be more effective. We spoke, maybe this is an opportunity to really look at getting aid to get behind national priorities. And there's no doubt that the first place where Africans need to look is at ourselves. It was mentioned here by a colleague from Zimbabwe, where she made the point that when we look at what provides development, I mean, the first challenge that we've had is Africa's not had an agricultural revolution. Without agriculture, it's very difficult to go up the manufacturing curve. The scenario in our work that delivers the highest rates of growth over the long term is the Continental Free Trade Area, full implementation, free trade within the continent. And then Africa needs to find a way to use modern technology to leapfrog, particularly provision of electricity, as well as internet access that can allow the continent to develop. But I think that in that process, we also have to get rid of some of our illusions. I want to mention one, because I live in Southern Africa, which I think has been proven. One of the problems that we have in Southern Africa is the dominance of liberation parties still in governance. They are a major problem, inhibitor to development. And we speak a lot about democracy, but we really need to find a way where accountability and good governance are really what this is all about. And that's really the challenge. How are we going to take that forward and make democracy and accountability really a positive for development? And I'll stop there. Thanks very much for the invitation, Nick.
Thanks so much, Jackie. That was great. And it reminds us, I think, of previous episodes of the Resistance Bureau where we've actually tackled that very question, the impact of former liberation movements and the challenges that former liberation movements can pose to, both to democracy and the achievement of development. So thanks for that. And people do remember that we have a lot of fantastic recordings of previous shows on our website for you. With that, I'm going to pass it back to our wonderful host, Jeff Mantade, with the thought that I think this has been one of our most interesting and important shows, guys. So congratulations. Thanks so much. And over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you so much to everyone that's spoken so far. This has been a very, very insightful conversation. And I like the fact that even though it's a heavy, difficult, very sad moment in conversation, there's a lot of thought around what should be done, what can be done. And I think it's great that we're living with that aspect of capability, the possibilities that exist. I think one of the things I wanted to just place on the table is one of the concerns that I also have around this reality of aid cuts is how the loss of jobs worldwide, because it's not just in the continent that people have lost jobs. There are people that have also lost jobs, particularly in the Western countries. So this loss in jobs will actually have a significant implication on African countries still, in the sense that many of the global consultancies and job opportunities that emerge in response to those shifts will unfortunately favor Western professionals who are now also facing unemployment. So this preference in itself will limit opportunities for African professionals and actually entrench existing inequalities. So you're looking at a situation where domestically the few available opportunities are also more likely to go to those with established experiences, people that have been in the space for longer. So what that means is that it's going to further marginalize young people and newcomers in the workspace. So it's a lot of things that actually exist in the global space that are going to be shaping the domestic experience. So I think it's very important for us to think about that, especially us as young people, because we're looking at young people that are coming straight from uni or that are still new in the civic space or across all of the other sectors that are affected. So that's something that I feel like we should also have in mind as we go away from this space. So Jeff, over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mentati, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We, of course, would have loved to keep this conversation going, but we must bring it to a close for now. And we'll definitely keep an eye on all these issues we've covered today, and we'll certainly highlight the really important work and the contributions that our speakers continue to make on this topic, and certainly across the board. All of you do incredibly critical work, and we appreciate you so much taking the time to be with us here today to help inform us as well as our audience and to engage on these important matters and to propose solutions going forward. A big thanks to our audience for contributing to the conversation as well. Please stay in touch between our shows by visiting our website and by subscribing on our homepage to get timely updates as well as show summaries, participant videos, and a lot of cool extras. On our website, as Nick mentioned, you can also revisit all of our past shows and the one-on-one interviews we've been conducting with experts on other emergent topics affecting the continent and its people. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And as a final note, the continued impact of the Resistance Bureau is a real testament to the efforts of our entire team. Thanks so much to our tech manager, Peter Dory, for keeping us on track today and always, and our creative advisor, Ndondo Msaka, who helps design all of the promotional images that you see on social media. So thank you again so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it. Stay safe out there, and we will see you next time on the Resistance Bureau.